All right, so this is going to be our third, I guess, not final class on Luke, but it's going to be like the final time we're talking about Jesus's rookie year, because he's about to start getting into the more notable parts like the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, which Luke's more described of on a gradual declining plane. But so this evening we'll be looking at Luke 5, starting in verse 27 and going through chapter 6, verses 11. And our rate for this week, if you are still keeping up with it, I know I am, but that doesn't mean anything because I wrote the lesson. But our grade this week is Jackie Robinson. I thought surely everyone would know who this is, but then I started talking to Dewey about it. And he's like, I guarantee you there's people who don't know who Jackie Robinson is. And I was like, really? Really? So some of our older classes should know who Jackie Robinson is. Some of our more young-oriented classes may struggle with who Jackie Robinson is, but he was the first African-American to play on the major league level. He was a first baseman for the then Brooklyn Dodgers, and he had to deal with a whole lot of breaking down of barriers, the color barrier. There was racism all around. I don't think I need to explain this to this group, but you may have to explain it more in your class depending on how many blank stares you get back. But I wanted to include him here because in this section of Luke, Jesus is doing a lot of breaking down of religious barriers because he's really going straight against what the Pharisees have kind of been teaching this whole time. We'll see it with tax collectors, with healing those who have wounds and et cetera, et cetera. But so that's why I wanted to include him. And I think we can easily kind of segue into this week's lesson. So if someone would like to read our first section, which will be Luke chapter 5, verses 27 through 32. That would be appreciated.
After that, he went out and noticed a tax collector named Levi sitting in a tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." He left everything behind, he got up and began to follow him. And Levi gave a big reception for him in his house, and there was a great crowd of tax collectors and other people who were reclining at the table with him, Pharisees and scribes. And their scribes began grumbling at his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "It is not those who are well who need a physician, those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance."
All right, thank you, Chess. First things first, I'm sure we'll probably get a question about this. So that's why I included it in our lesson plan. Why is Matthew called Levi in Luke's gospel, but in Acts he's called Matthew? That's a great question. There's a bunch of different debates on why something like this would occur. Some try and point to it as, well, we have Simon, who's then called Peter, and we have Saul, who's then called Paul, and kind of following that line of logic. Well, Levi was probably his original name, but then he was renamed Matthew. But unlike Simon, Peter, and Paul, the renaming process is not really recorded. It's well recorded that Jesus says, "Simon, who I will now call Peter." It's a very well documented and recorded moment. And then on the other hand, we have the road to Damascus. Saul's called out, and then shortly after he's starting to be referred to as Paul. And so it's a well recorded change. And we would think if Levi / Matthew is the same individual who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, that he would have at least made note of it, because there's a lot of little tidbits that Matthew kind of includes that the other Gospels don't. And so you have that. But what's probably more of what's being caught on camera, I guess you could say, not that they had cameras back then, but what's going on is Jewish males, especially, would often have two names. It'd be similar to someone who goes by their middle name to everyone, except to like their family, because in their family it's always the first name. Because you don't tell your mom that I want you to call me by my middle name. You're being called by the name she gave you, and so it's kind of that. There's probably that is a more modern take of kind of what's going on. They would have two names, a more proper official name, and then one that's more, I guess, laid back in a sense. And so we have this whole debacle, and it's not really that important. We don't need to spend a whole lot of time on it, but there will be most likely at least one in one of our classes, someone's going to ask it. So I wanted to kind of give that information so we can be able to handle it in our classes. But moving on, this is our first story in which we see the Pharisees and Jesus kind of clash against one another. If we look back to last week's, we had the calling of Peter, James, and John, or I guess it's still Simon, James, and John at this point in Luke's narrative. But now if we compare the two, what's going on here is though Simon, James, and John were fishermen and would have been lower status citizens, what we have here is Jesus is calling an individual who no one would have liked. And I'm sure we all heard the sermons and the lessons on this, but tax collectors were considered the lowest of the lows, or one of the lowest of the lows, because they were seen as race traitors, if you would. They betrayed their own people to go serve an authority figure that's not of their own, and that they're often seen as greedy and vicious, because to make their living, they would have to artificially raise how much you would have to collect tax-wise so they could get a paycheck, because the Romans weren't calculating that when they were setting the taxes. They were just setting the tax of this is what we are expecting to go to Rome. And so we had a lot of greed going on. We see it with Zacchaeus later in the Gospels, where Zacchaeus has used this position of power as a tax collector to gain exorbitant amounts of wealth, and he's using his power to really affect people, and it's made him very unpopular. But even here, Matthew would have also been very unpopular, and just the type of person it would take to be a tax collector, it'd have to be someone who's very detail oriented. They're not just letting any Joe Schmo who can kind of do math be a tax collector. He would have to be very meticulous. He would have to know weights and different values of different precious metals. You can't just look it up on his phone. He has to kind of know that by heart, forwards and backwards. And so he's been everyone's least favorite person for a while. And so it's a big, significant moment that Jesus comes to him and calls him out, probably out of a crowd. And he's being called out and saying, similar to Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house today. I'm coming to you. I want you to leave everything you know behind to come serve me, which we also get this image when the other three disciples who have been called so far in Luke's gospel were called. It's this idea of when we're called to discipleship, we're supposed to leave everything. We're supposed to drop what we're doing. We're not kind of supposed to just keep doing what we have been doing. We've been called out of that way of life, that way of making money, that way of providing for ourselves, and we're supposed to be giving that to God. We're supposed to be putting our trust fully in God as disciples. But then we get kind of the conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus. The Pharisees do not like that that Jesus is coming and he's sitting with these sinful people, these greedy individuals. And to them, as we've kind of hit several times throughout some of our lessons, they're expecting this deliverer from oppression. And so to them, this symbol of Roman authority, Roman control, Roman authority over people, that is taking the wealth of Israel out of Israel. And so for the Messiah to go and eat with those individuals would have probably gone against everything that they had expected. And that's even for those that were kind of expecting, okay, maybe it wasn't a literal warrior king who's going to be our deliverer. And so we kind of have that of the Pharisees aren't all just the same person who has the same ideas and thoughts every time. We kind of have this, it's a group of people and they all have different ideas of what the Messiah should be and look like. And so there's no unity on their side either. But we have this clashing of, well, we definitely know that the Messiah should not be eating with tax collectors because they're sinful. And then Jesus responds as, it's not the sinful, it's not the non-sinful, I guess, would be a way of putting it. It's not the righteous who need saving. If you could save yourself because of what you've done and you're good enough, you don't need a savior. And so I'm going to jump kind of towards Paul's arguments in his epistles of, this is kind of the crux of New Testament church of, if we were able to do enough good to not need a savior, Jesus wouldn't have come. There would be no need for Jesus in our history and in our world. However, he still came because we all still fell short of the glory of God. We all still needed that savior, and especially the sinners. I guess one way I've always thought of it is, this is the emergency room. And yes, the doctor's there for everyone, but the doctor's especially there for the one who's bleeding out and is needing the most emergency attention, and not just the one who is lightheaded and doesn't know what to do. There's two different needs in an emergency room, but it doesn't mean that they don't both need the doctor. So I hope that makes sense. What did you guys see in this section?
Come back in. So slap the Pharisees that one statement. He says, I didn't come for the righteous, I came for the sinners. Well, we are all sinners. They viewed themselves as righteous. So he was kind of a subtle slap at them. You think you're righteous. I didn't come for you. It is confusing if you look at that. He only came for the sinners, not for the righteous. Well, no one's righteous. I really think he was kind of doing a subtle slap at them. He took every opportunity he had to do that. That was just part of talking to them. They probably got it.
Yeah, I noticed two interesting kind of comparisons between Matthew and the Pharisees. I mean, I wrote down, who does Jesus choose to eat with? Well, he eats with those that he wants to identify with. Why did the Pharisees not choose to eat with certain people? It was the same reason. There were certain people they wanted to identify with. But then what Jesus does, you mentioned it, he called Matthew out of what he knew, what was familiar to him, to something completely different. Basically, he's really doing the same thing to the religious leaders. He's calling them to something new, something that was outside of their comfort zone.
It always makes me wonder if Levi, if they had already been having interactions, or if this is, he just sees Jesus. I mean, we don't get much about what is the depth of any kind of relationship.
Well, God is, Jesus looked at it and said, follow me, got left.
Mm-hmm.
I have to wonder how much he already knew with believing.
That's a good point you bring up, Dewey, because who we hang out with really is an identity kind of a thing. And so Jesus just, as he does, he just totally flipped upside down what the religious institutions of the day thought was, I guess godly.
So, and that's kind of what the focus of this week's is because Luke has this section where it's just one after another, just flipping what people, especially the Pharisees, had thought was godly, and turning it on its head. And that's kind of why I wanted to keep these sections together, because it is important to kind of hit those points. So, anyone else have any questions? I hope I wasn't cutting you off, Ken.
No.
Okay. All right. And so we get to the next section, and I'll go ahead and read this. And it's chapter 5, verses 33 through 39. And it reads, "And they said to him, the disciples of John fast often, and they offer prayers. And so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. And Jesus said to them, can you make a wedding guest fast while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will not fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. And if he does, the new wine will burst, and the skins will burst the skins, and it will be spilled. And the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says, the old is good." All right. So this kind of section is a little confusing. One thing I wanted to point out is Luke kind of does this a couple times where he compares the Pharisees and their disciples, John and his disciples, and then Jesus and his disciples. And we kind of already saw that with kind of the baptism, where it was, well, the Pharisees already kind of have a baptism, and then John has a different baptism, but there's one to come, Christ, will have a completely different baptism. And so here we have another one of these moments where we see, the Pharisees fast and John fasts, so why don't you and your disciples, Jesus, fast? And Jesus kind of avoids the question, or at least it seems like that. Really, Jesus kind of tips his hand on what's going on here. And it may just be because I had a similar conversation with Stephen earlier this week about covenants and all of that, and comparing it to baptism and all this. But Jesus kind of compares what he is doing as a wedding. There is a wedding that is happening. And we have kind of these two covenants going on. the old covenant, which was made with Abraham and renewed with Moses, and that's the covenant of David and all the kings of Israel and Judah. That covenant is coming to an end. Not saying it's being thrown out, but the things that held that together are kind of having to be reclassified. There's something new that's coming out and will come out of Christ's crucifixion. But it's like a wedding where it hasn't quite happened yet. So the new doesn't have any real effect quite yet, but the old is also like, I don't want these disciples, my students, to get used to this old way before teaching them the new way, because then I have to basically reteach them again so that they won't want to go back to that old way. And that's how he ended this section of, if they only drank the old wine, or if they only knew the old stuff, well, then they will have no reason to think, well, we need the new thing. There's something new that has to come on the scene. Because what Jesus is doing is he's slowly poking holes and pointing to these moments where the law is falling short. Your understanding is falling short of what's going to need to take place. We're trying to point towards God and a relationship with God, and by being divisive towards one another about the law, and well, he did this, he broke this law, and so I can't be I can't help him know God. Well, that's not helping anything. And now you're actually working against your own relationship with God, because now you're focused way too much on who's doing the right things on the right times. And so you have this weird instance of, yes, the law is good, but the time for the law and being very legalistic on following the T's and the I's and making sure the commas are in the right spot, that time's kind of over. Yeah, and so Jesus is kind of saying, this is coming to an end and something new is coming. And when that time comes with this new thing, yeah, my disciples will fast. Yeah, my disciples will devote themselves to prayer, because they're going to have that understanding of why they're doing it. If they were to be taught now to fast and to pray, it's just to basically check a checkbox off and say, yeah, I fasted and prayed because the Pharisees wanted me to fast and pray. But there's a purpose in the new covenant, in this new relationship, is when we fast and when we pray, it's so that we can take time of rest and Sabbath and solitude to be with God and to be in the silence of, and just be in the presence of God and communicate with him one-on-one. But if we're just doing it to say we met the law, that's not what we're doing. And so I may have kind of gone off on a rabbit hole. Does that make sense to you guys? I don't want to lose any of you.
It makes sense. I think one of the things that I struggle with the whole concept of this is that, as his disciples, they never got it until when? Till he was raised from dead, right? Because even in Matthew, he says, aren't you dull? I mean, basically he says, are you guys stupid? You don't get it. So, they struggle with this concept. And that's what, we inherit what we bring to the table. Tom brings a different stroke than I do. I bring some to the table. So we inherit that, right? Mm-hmm. Can be so strong. But can you imagine having all your life saying, hey, this is what's going to happen. This is what I live under the old law. So I can't blame my whole life. It's like coming here and saying, yeah, I'm Joseph Smith and I'm a new prophet and I want you to believe it. I can't imagine that. But he actually called his disciples basically stupid. You don't get it. You got to get it. So if they didn't get it, how do we get frustrated with people because they don't get it right today? These guys watched him walk on water, they watched him do miracles, and they still didn't get it. So I struggle with that a little bit. Can you help me, Bergan?
I can only try.
I think it's fun, just looking at this picture that you have, the slide here. Where did the Pharisees and, where did they come up with all the garb?
Part of it is what was commanded. for the priest at least.
Yeah, but the Pharisees
No.
weren't necessarily
No.
priests.
But,
They would,
So they came up with their own
yeah.
stuff, like
It was just
to show who,
a perversion of
yeah,
of the law.
it was it was building off of what the priestly garb was supposed to be. In a time when there wasn't really priests. And so it was kind of it's still I'm gonna wear something different because I want you to look at me and look at what I'm doing. Because
And look at how holy I am.
look at how holy I am, because I have the cleanest clothes, or I'm doing this, and it's when we get to, I don't know if it's in Luke, but when Jesus is talking about, well, the Pharisees go on the street corners and pray openly in public.
Yeah.
Well, that's not how you're supposed to pray. You're supposed to be praying on an individual level. Well, the Pharisees are very consumed with, I have to do this so other people can know who I am
it gets
before
back
they
to-
know who God
It
is.
gets back to identity, and he's talking about fasting, and apparently when they fasted, everybody knew they were fasting.
Mhm.
Man, that guy, look how gaunt, look how look how disheveled he is, he must be, and so, again, it just kind of gets back to this identity, and Jesus is, we do the same things. We
And
do
by the
the
way, the
same.
answer is, and I went to the play last week. It's tradition.
Yes. But we can sometimes fall into the same trap. There are some people that we hold up. And many times we seek that recognition as opposed to what Jesus did, is he came and he sought to be identified with the lowly, the people that are not recognized, the people that are lame, and so again, how many times do we do that? We're not wanting to be up in the front, being noticed by people. We're seeking quietly people who need help and serving, but we can easily fall into the same trap that the religious leaders of that day.
Oh, yeah.
There's another trap that I saw, because it talks about the new wine, the old wineskins, the bursting of the skins. It's that punchline in verse 39 where it says, no one after drinking old wine desires new. It says, behold is good. Like, the old memes. Who says the old is good? Well, no one ever. But how many of us do that? We come to Christ for something new, but man, we want to hold on to some of that old. And we don't realize that we're really harming our relationship with Christ by holding on to that old stuff. We wind up not experiencing that relationship like Jesus wants us to.
Well, and it's hard to come out of that deep religious, these guys were, that's what they did, they studied, right? They were teachers. They were well thought of, so you start thinking to yourself that, start for you to realize that you're talking to God at the same time. God's emotions, I think, were said, hey, you get frustrated with me, you do, I know you do this. Can you imagine living with me as a Pharisee then? Pretension and all the robes and all the stuff, and said, hey, I struggle with this section of my life. I think we beat the Pharisees up, rightfully so, but where there's good Pharisees, yeah, we were absolutely. So I think we pigeonhole them in one difference that Jesus made. Jesus had the ability to read your mind. So you know what you're thinking, right? Had no ability to do that. But the difference is he knew that the disciples wouldn't get it, so it's frustrating. But then sometimes we have the ample opportunity to get it, right? And we don't. So he's got to be frustrated a little bit with us, right? Don't you get it, Steve? Wake up, buddy. You ever tug it on the shoulder hooks to wake up? So I think it speaks to us more today. Jesus came to give us life, give it more abundantly. How do you get that abundance, or how do you experience that abundance? Inundated with everyday problems. Right? It's not because we're trying to do all this, because we're trying to do what we want to do, not what he wants to do. We really don't have a choice as Christians. We either got to be about his business or about ours. So we somewhere in between. It's very thoughtful.
One of the things I was thinking about is, one of the hardest things to do is read through the scripture with new eyes.
This one.
New eyes. We too often we go to scripture to prove our point rather than to look to see what God has to say to us today. And if you can, the times that you do, I mean, you may not have any, great revelation, but you'll come across a text and say, oh, yeah, I understand what that means. And one of these days, maybe I'll be reading this and that'll happen. But it's, there's just so many things in there that just kind of baffle me. What's Jesus really trying to say there? But that's one of the things that I'm really focusing on with my daily Bible reading this year. I'm going through the Gospels 4 times throughout the year, and then going through the rest of the New Testament once during that same time. But
It's a struggle for me in terms of this, accepting this. Understanding this, emotionally, though, how you live your life, having more fun. This I can understand, I understand most days, but what happens when you have a really bad day? You have cancer, something else. I think there's going to be some people in our classes who are going to ask that question.
All right, so the next section will be,
Can we go back? Oh, what's the difference is there because Jesus sought out Matthew? Did we talk about that? I didn't hear that. Question up at the top.
yes, so going back one for Steve.
Sorry.
No, you're good. I forgot to mention it. I included this question kind of as something you may want to ask your class of, what is the significance or what significance is there because Jesus sought out Matthew? And I think we kind of touched on it Jesus, for the same reason why the Pharisees stayed away from the tax collectors. There's a significance that Jesus came and sought tax collectors to be with because that's who he wanted to be around. He didn't want to be around these haughty-taughty religious leaders because who would have debated him to death if they could on what do you really mean or what are you talking about this? But he's seeking these tax collectors because they need to come to, I guess, different understanding of God just as these Pharisees do. And it's significant because Matthew would have been one of those low people. He would have been, he would have probably been dressed nice because he had money, but he wasn't necessarily doing it because he wanted to attract attention to himself.
So what was Matthew's purpose? I'm not being facetious. I'm not being condescending. What was Matthew's purpose?
Well,
Right, one of the Gospels.
yeah.
Throughout one of the Gospels, yeah. But I mean, deeper.
you talking about his purpose in one of the 12?
Yes. I mean, that's what I'm struggling with the concept.
Many of the apostles, you really don't get a lot about them after
Yeah.
the resurrection.
One of the-
But you figure that he understood a certain class of people and a certain lifestyle. And who better could go preach to them than someone who understood them and reach them where they were. And if you look, Jesus picked people from just about every type of lifestyle you can imagine, because he knew that was gonna be needed. Because, a fisherman's not gonna appeal to a banker. They're not on the same level.
Well, I
But
think even-
Matthew could appeal to a banker.
maybe even more, think of Matthew and Simon the Zealot being in the same group of people. Simon would have been. Yo. Yes.
Don't you think there had to be something deeper in Matthew that Jesus selected him than just because he could appeal to appeal to certain person? I mean,
He obviously could see man's spirit, and he knew.
yeah, I
I
mean,
think verse 30 tells us, Pharisees and scribes be grumbling as disciples, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners, right? I mean, I've come to follow, not follow the righteous, but the sinners. I mean, it's not just a slap at the Pharisees. I mean,
What he came to do.
it's what he came to do, and he knows that, I mean, look, when you call Matthew, you get in the door, and I've got more people to minister to. I mean, I think there's an aspect of, the gospel's open. Gospel's open to everybody, and it's not the religious elite. And that's where, and I think that's what he's getting across. It's not for the religious elite that think they have it all done, that they've got it figured out. And the call that I'm giving is open to all, as it has been.
And what Jesus could have done is just said, hey, I came to call those guys. What he did was he actually did it and opened that door.
and they answered the call. I guess I'm not making myself real. Matthew, Mark, they pretty similar. John's a little different in terms of the Gospels. But there's got to be, in my opinion, or at least a little different reason that Jesus might have picked Matthew. He was a tax collector, I know, and we make a lot of assumptions about God knew our hearts. And I guess I'm saying that we always pigeonhole Matthew into that segment. There'll be something deeper seated there. Could he have had some special qualities? And I guess that's what I'm asking. Jesus knew one thing, that he would be moved by the Spirit, right? He knew that, I mean, he wrote the gospel after. I mean, you look at his first verse of Matthew and all the detail on that. So he knew he would listen, right? He yielded his spirit to God's spirit. And I'm struggling with Matthew's purpose, because if he's a taxpayer, it's his only purpose to teach them, or was his purpose much broader than that? Because his name lives on forever and ever, right? So it had to be something a little deeper than just because he was a taxpayer. And I don't know, I think we speculate a lot about the characters. Yeah, he was a taxpayer, but he had some other qualities there that Jesus saw. So help me out with what those qualities are, because I got some people who are really going to ask that question out too Sunday.
I don't know if we have the answer necessarily, but I think, you watch The Chosen, and I think The Chosen is attempting to answer that question. I don't think we can really get it, but I think there's an aspect of that they're attempting to answer that question. Matthew's the guy that's sitting there with Jesus as he's writing the Sermon on the Mount. And, there's little things like that where they're learning how to include him in their discussion, despite the fact that every one of those Jews sitting in the disciple room, the apostles' room, is somebody that he would have charged tax to, potentially, whatever. And learning how to love one another well, despite the fact that you don't like each other. And I don't know what the special, but I think, like I said, you watch The Chosen, and I think they're trying to answer the same question. Nobody has the answer. I think it's just a speculation. But it's kind of fun to see, even with The Chosen. We don't know, The Chosen may be wrong, but the fact is they're trying to answer the same question in some ways.
Well, I'm not trying to be hard. Just trying to-
I think we can get to the same question. Why did Jesus choose me?
Yeah.
And I think that answer is very similar. Maybe not the same, but it's very similar. Because I needed to be chosen.
Yeah.
I need to be saved.
Well, I mean, he entrusted Matthew with what? Probably one of the Gospels, besides what I said. Has to be something deeper seated than just a tax collector. And I get that he probably wouldn't really like to sign. It's gotta be something the heart wise that he might have listened to, right? Just,
And I think you see in that, you know, and you can do it with a number of the other apostles too. It says, this is for everybody, not just those elite, not just the fishermen, you know, not just this guy over here. It's a very diverse group of 12 men.
I don't want to cut this conversation short,
sorry.
but we do have like half of our lesson to get through. And so we'll kind of approach it kind of together because they're kind of building off one another. So if someone would read, starting in chapter 6, verse 1, and then read through verse 11.
One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.' On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Get up and stand in front of everyone.' So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to him, 'I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?' He looked around at them all, and then he said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But they were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus."
All right, thank you, Ken. So in the first 5 verses, what we get is Jesus' disciples break the laws of the Sabbath. We kind of start to see the Pharisees' understanding of the law kind of crumble. The Pharisees are very much it is the letter of the law that you are not to do work on the Sabbath. And so anyone who does any type of work on the Sabbath is deserving of death, because that's what Exodus and Leviticus all say, kind of. Yes, it does say those who violate Sabbath deserve death, but it's not in this idea of going back to what was the section we were just in? The fasting portion. It's not you're just fasting to fast, or you're just taking a Sabbath to take a Sabbath. You're doing it. The intended purpose is you're doing it for God, and you're supposed to be pointing in that direction and not just following it because there's a set of instructions that say so. And so, which the Pharisees also are kind of this group, and I think I may have mentioned this before in here or in just another discussion. So forgive me if I am kind of jumping in without explaining the beginning. But the Pharisees were a group that kind of looked at the law and said, well, the law was what set the nations apart. Well, in our modern scholarship, we know that's not true. We look at ancient Babylonian and ancient Assyrian and even ancient Egypt or Egyptian laws. They have some of the very similar laws that we find in the 10 Commandments. It's not, God's not recreating the wheel when he goes and discusses the law with Moses on Mount Sinai, or as it's being revealed while they're in the wilderness. And we can get into the whole discussion of what's occurring in the wilderness and at Sinai. But what is happening with the law is it's not the law that set it apart. It's because it's who the law came from. It came from God. Israel was supposed to be set apart because of their God. Yahweh was supposed to be their claim to fame. You could tell who the Israelites were because they worshiped Yahweh, this creator, this all-powerful God who isn't like the other Canaanite gods like Baal or Tiamat or Mut, who kind of have their own like humanistic flaws. Yahweh isn't the God who gets drunk and goes and impregnates a mountain, and that's why we have volcanoes. That's not what's happening with Yahweh. He is a well put together God, and so that was what the law was trying to point it to. Is this is important because it's from Yahweh, and so we kind of get to this idea of Jesus is sitting there, and they're saying, "Well, your disciples are breaking the law. They're doing work, which." If we were getting really granular on what counts as work, I guess you could say rubbing your hands together with kernels in the middle of it could be considered work. But it's not construction. Like we're not building a house here. They're rubbing their hands together so that they have food to eat. And so we have that idea of you're so worried about this law and the idea of the law itself being important. And so you are missing the whole picture. You're focusing way too much on one tree that you're neglecting the whole forest of what's going on here. And so Jesus kind of has to put him in the place of, I am the Son of Man. And this is one of the first times in Luke's gospel, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. We had the demons a couple of chapters ago kind of proclaim who he was. And Jesus said, it's not time. You need to stop talking. And so now Jesus is saying, I am the Son of Man. And to our audience, it probably sounds a little clunky. Like, okay, Jesus, cool, you said your name. What is that supposed to mean? Well, to the Pharisees, they kind of have this expectation of the Son of Man is the Messiah who is basically God, which he is to us as well. And so the idea of him declaring himself as God on the Sabbath, and that's what the Sabbath is supposed to be pointing to, is to say, I'm the one who has the authority to say what is right and wrong to do on the Sabbath. And what my disciples are doing is not wrong. It's not evil. And then we get to this second part, which is also another Sabbath story. The Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus into doing work. But at least when I read this, Jesus isn't really working, he's just kind of talking and giving instruction. Because the verb for the man when he raised his hand, that is the same word that would be used to imply raising your hand to put it to the plow or to lift a tool. So in the literary sense, the man is the one who's doing work on the Sabbath. But what's happening is Jesus heals him without even really lifting a finger. And so they're like, he did work. But according to their rules, he didn't lift his hands. He didn't touch anything. He didn't pick up a tool. If anything, the guy who had the broken hand did work. But then again, it goes back to the idea of they're too concerned with this idea of what is or isn't classified as work, what is or isn't acceptable to do on a Sabbath. That Jesus, knowing this, knowing what's on their hearts and what's on their minds, kind of traps them in one of their loopholes. Because there are exceptions to the rules of, you're not supposed to do work on the Sabbath. You're supposed to only be basically in time with God. Well, to Jesus, he's pointing out, yeah, it's right. You're not supposed to do work on the Sabbath. But what about those other exceptions that have been highlighted of, yeah, David had to go ask for food from the priests. That was doing good for the priests, and yet God didn't strike down the priest or strike down David for breaking that law on the Sabbath. And then we get to this idea of I'm saving someone's life. I'm giving them their livelihood and giving it back to them. And so is it better that I just not do that? Because tomorrow he may not be in town. So like me waiting a day wouldn't help the guy. It's, I have him here, I can help him now. Is it wrong for me to help someone on a Sabbath just because of the day of the week it is? I hope that makes sense. I'll
I think one
ask if you want.
of the things that struck me in Mark's account, Jesus, you know, he asked them the question, is it lawful to do good? And they didn't answer it. Yeah, he said, it says, and after looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. I mean, you know, it's amazing to me where Jesus is, you know, where it speaks of him being angry, what he's angry at. Pride, a hardness of heart, you know, a refusal to come to terms with what's right. Because, I mean, this is like a simple question. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? I mean,
My understanding, this is my best understanding about Sabbath, is that God didn't want them to work. He didn't want them, he wanted us to trust him.
Mhm.
Trust him with our livelihood, trust him with, our provisions. And so he didn't want us doing gainful employment on the Sabbath because he knew that we needed rest, the animals needed rest, and we needed to be able to trust him to provide. And then he has the Sabbath year, like every 7th year, and then the Jubilee and everything. And so it's not about, yes, in the pure terms of physics, doing this is work. If you raise some mass against, raise it, then you've done work. That's not what he's talking about. And so again, we can get off course and, not see the forest for the trees because we've made up all these rules about how many steps you can take and all that kind of stuff. And basically, he's just like, I want you to rest because it's good for your body, it's good for your soul. I want you to focus on me, trust in me, spend time with your family, and then we turn it into everything else.
Yeah. And they still, I'll go off on a tangent here. When I was in Israel, I got to be there on like 2 Sabbaths. And they're so still stringent about what is or isn't work. That all their elevators just stop at every floor on the Sabbath because it's work to press a button. Like to press a button is still something that they consider as work. So they're looking for so if that was the kind of the idea here, they were looking for like the smallest thing of wrongdoing in someone. Say you have violated Sabbath and are deserving of death.
And Jesus knew what buttons to push intentionally. He was intentionally pushing. If he had intentionally done it, I guess he knew, right? He had intentionally, or he would never have been put on the cross. It's intentional.
Yes. And then this week's closing thoughts. We kind of touched on this earlier, how we're like the Pharisees sometimes, but Jesus this week is kind of breaking these religious barriers down. Because so many had put up barriers to justify themselves, excluding the lessers from knowing who God is. And I want us to kind of reflect on, have we in our churches, in our relationship with God and our interactions with others, have we unknowingly or somewhat knowingly put up a barrier that's preventing someone from knowing God? And if so, how do we kind of tear down those barriers or start to tear down those barriers with those individuals? So,
Yeah, some of us need to tear down barriers to keep us from knowing God first.
Say that again, dude.
Some of us need to learn to tear down some barriers that are preventing us from knowing God first. Easy there, you're getting a little first. Sorry.
that's my lesson, or the outline, at least for this lesson. So go and make it your own.
Thank you, Bergan.